Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, welcome everyone to this session. The session's paper will be presented by Marco Magasic. Marco is a PhD candidate at Deakin University and is a member of the university's Rural Communication Research Cluster. His talk is titled Newspaper Closure, Civic Culture and Civic Impact, Where to Turn When the Local Paper Shuts Down. Over to you, Marco.
Thank you, Alison. And hello everyone, and thanks for tuning into my presentation. Right at the end of the day. So today I'm going to be talking about how civic culture. I'm going to be talking about civic culture and how it is propagated by local newspapers and how it is impacted when they shut down. The presentation is based on a journal article I'm hoping to publish with my supervisors, Christy Hess and Julie Freeman, and in turn it takes data from my PhD thesis. So as we all know, the local news industry, along with all legacy media, has dealt with huge shocks to its business model since the advent of the digital era. Around Australia and the world, these shocks have led to several local newspapers shutting down and leaving the towns they once serviced in news gaps, where people no longer have access to a credible and consistent source of local news. Of course, this was accelerated with the advent of the pandemic. My PhD takes a multifaceted view of how people are impacted. It takes in how their political, social, and civic lives are affected. However, this presentation will focus on the impact on civic culture when a local newspaper shuts down. So the way I'm going to structure this talk is first I'll discuss the concept of civic culture and how I use it to interpret the data in this presentation. I'll then give an overview of Lightning Ridge, the town I conducted my research in, and how its newspaper, the Ridge News, fit into the civic culture. I'll then introduce Dot Thompson, a woman who got into a dispute with the local council, who in the past would have used the local newspaper as a way to reach out to her community for support, and how the lack of the local newspaper meant that this support never eventuated. So moving on, I'll now discuss the concept of civic culture and how local newspapers fit into this. So the way I argue and understand the civic is that it is a separate concept from the political and the social. This helps recognise the multifaceted role that local newspapers play in people's lives. In journalism studies, the political is often used to refer to the news media's role as watchdogs of governmental institutions and elected representatives, or to its fourth estate function in facilitating political debate within the public sphere. Here, local news occupies an important space in disseminating information and promoting discussion about local political institutions. The social, meanwhile, encompasses how journalism and news media contribute to community culture and rituals, and how it plays a role in establishing social order and connection. The civic sits in between the political and the social. So Peter Dogren, who a lot of this presentation's work is based on, he writes about civic culture, and he says that the civic is the social foundation for political action to happen. The civic turn, this cultural turn has led to the introduction of notions such as civic culture, cultural citizenship, public connection, and sub-activism. Dogren argues that while the boundaries between the civic and political are blurred and difficult to distinguish, it is important that we do in order to understand civic culture. So where political activities can include voting in an election, a civic action could be attending a protest. Or another political action could be writing to an MP, whereas a different civic action could be volunteering for a local organisation. So Dogren defines culture as patterns of communication, practices and meaning that exist in our heads, guiding and informing action, speech and understanding. So while culture doesn't determine how we act, it puts up invisible markers that guide our behaviour when we're faced with issues that impact ourselves and our communities. And he offers 6 preconditions for civic culture to thrive. And they are shared values, an affinity with social and political entities, access to shared sources of knowledge, which is the local newspaper, established practices of civic action and identity of citizenship, and discussion of civic issues. And together, these dimensions illustrate how a person must be invested in shared ideals, shared sources of information, and be in the habit of discussing civic issues and acting upon them. So, Lightning Ridge is a remote town located in outback New South Wales, about 9 hours drive from both Sydney and Brisbane, near the Queensland border. It is the only place in the world where black opal is mined, which creates an atmosphere of a frontier town because of the many people who live in the surrounding opal fields. The census says the population is about 2,300, but in winter it swells to 5,000 when everyone comes back having escaped the heat. It's also easy to live off grid out on a claim, so it's hard to count the exact population. And it's this ability to live away from the authorities, away from society, and to be able to strike the rich without the taxman knowing that makes the place feel like a frontier town in the Wild West. And that is what informs its civic culture. So to gather my data, I conducted a focused ethnography, and I lived in Lightning Ridge for over 2 months and actively participated in town life. While I was there, I volunteered, I had a job, I went to church, and I tried to get as involved as possible. Along with participant observation, I used interviews, ethnographic discussions, which are like loosely organised focus groups, and I watched movies and read articles about Lightning Ridge and read old copies of the town's newspapers. So during my fieldwork, the people I spoke to argued that the town had its own unique civic culture that grew out of the opal mining industry. So here, Doug ran 6 preconditions of civic culture begin to materialise as residents see themselves sharing an identity as opal miners and investing their own time in their town. So participants argued that opal miners work independently in dangerous and isolated conditions in a remote town that traditionally does not receive its fair share of funding from all levels of government. This means that Lightning Ridge residents only have themselves to look out for in times of trouble, and even to build the infrastructure and provide the services that government has not. So I'll now read out 2 quotes from 2 people I interviewed. First comes from Kimbo Field, a woman I met at the pub. And she said, "It's only the closeness of people in Lightning Ridge that lets us know what's going on. And if we had a paper, a lot more people would know that someone's camp got burnt out or who's facing hardship and needs help. We're a close-knit community, and I'm sure that even if it's clothes or white goods or whatever they need to help, if people know about it, then they'll help." And this is a quote from Dot, who this presentation centres around. She's talking about the newspaper in general. "In our newspaper years ago, I organised a working bee to tidy up the cemetery. I bring the coffee, you bring the gloves. Because of that effort, our cemetery is spick and span." So Dr. states that affinity with institutions instigates an active citizenry. In Lightning Ridge, however, residents have an affinity with their town, community, and history of opal mining. And this is seen when you go there, imagery of the gems emblazoned on most shops and businesses and people's business cards. And those 2 quotes also demonstrate that the place the Ridge News had as a shared information source and medium for discussion. So moving on beyond individual acts of charity and volunteering, the unique civic culture has demonstrated more strongly through the many large infrastructure projects and services that are mostly funded and run without government help. So this includes the Olympic diving and swimming pool, which was built by local tradesmen who donated their services and which was paid for through community fundraising. The Australian Opal Centre, which is a volunteer-run organisation that's currently building a $33 million facility that will be an archaeology research centre and museum. The Lightning Ridge Funeral Advisory Service, which is a volunteer-run morgue and undertaker service that provides free embalming, free casket and burial to Lightning Ridge residents. And the Lightning Flash, which was Lightning Ridge's first local newspaper, the one that's pictured here. And that was started as a way to raise money for the Bush Nurses Association. And so it's in this climate where the practice of looking out for fellow opal miners becomes a tradition for large-scale grassroots-led civic initiatives. As has been found in towns around the world, communities have a pattern of civic behaviour that serve as markers that suggest how people respond to civic issues. In Lightning Ridge, at its best, these patterns of behaviour are seen to compel residents strongly associated to their town to act with civic mindedness to overcome challenges by using the community as a resource over those offered by governmental organisations. So now I'm going to read out a vignette that I've taken from a PhD, which explains who Dot is and also about her dispute with the Walgett Shire Council. And that's Dot there in her camp with her animal welfare shelter with some dogs. And the story is also going to explain the Ridge News's place in propagating civic culture and how its closure impacted the flow of information. So Dot Thompson once walked into the Walgett Shire Council General Office's manager with a box full of feral kittens and let them loose. As the kittens ran around the office, they were filmed and uploaded onto the internet. While the video was eventually taken down, it is a story people now commonly tell about Dot. There was also an important point to this stunt that demonstrated Dot's civic engagement and the wider civic culture in Lightning Ridge. Previously, there was no avenue to humanely put down the feral animals that had become a large problem in the area. The feral cats were not only putting pressure on native wildlife, but were so aggressive that people were getting attacked too. Dot has run Lightning Ridge's unofficial animal welfare shelter for over 30 years. People were calling on her when they trapped feral cats on their property. The ranger would then come to her camp to collect and shoot them, putting Dot in a moral dilemma between letting them get brutally shot or releasing them into the wild to continue harming native wildlife. So Dot wanted the council to set up a euthanasia clinic. However, they were slow in implementing it, hence her taking the box of feral kittens into the general manager's office. And her council office antics worked, and in coordination with a Walgett-based vet, the local authorities now euthanize feral cats. Dot has always been proactive with issues that she sees in the community. From her camp, she organises dissecting clinics, rescues injured wildlife, is called on as a snake handler. The police call her to deal with aggressive animals, and she provides first aid to pets in emergencies. The vet lives over an hour away and only comes to town once a week. So Dot's presence in the community is appreciated and considered essential. While she's willing to do all of these things for no payment, she does not have all the licenses needed to legally run a pound. Then one day in 2019, the council ranger came to her door and gave her a list of thousands of dollars worth of fines she could be charged with, money which she could not afford. She put on a week-long garage sale to raise money for what she believed were impending fines. In the past, Dot had used the local newspaper to organise civic events, like a working bee to tidy up the cemetery. However, without the newspaper, Dot says the only way she could effectively spread the word about her fundraiser garage sale was with a few flyers and through word of mouth. And as a result, a lot of people had not heard about her plight. So, as seen by this story, Dot provides a valuable and much needed service to Lightning Ridge residents. And the importance of the animal welfare shelter was demonstrated to me several times during the field work. So this is an entry I've taken out of my field diary about a conversation I struck up with a woman in the bowling club. While waiting, Justine, who works at the bowling club, told me that her dog got hit by a car. I asked her where she took it and she said to Dot, and doesn't know where to take it otherwise. So, however, when Dot needed community support, she said she desperately wanted a local newspaper to tell her story. And I found out about Dot's animal welfare shelter through a flyer on a telegraph pole advertising a garage sale. The flyer didn't really have any information about Dot or what she did or why she was holding it. It simply said animal welfare shelter garage sale. So followed the directions into the opal fields and to Dot's camp. And eventually we started talking and she told me about the trouble with the council. When we met a few days later for a formal interview, she handed me a printout with a list of regulations she had apparently breached, and of which these fines tallied into the thousands of dollars. She said the council ranger had turned up one day and handed her the list. So throughout our interview, Dot spoke about the need for a local newspaper and her inability to use social media. So she listed several instances where a local newspaper was needed or might be needed. And this is a quote from our interview. I cannot afford these fines, and that's it. Everyone has to obey the law. But I'd like to have my say in the paper. I'm sure people would have lots to say in the local paper. Attention needs to be put on this Hudson pair. There was a multinational barbecue at the pool and half the people missed it because they didn't know it was on. Everyone needs a way of expressing themselves and I can't type. So after the interview, I also saw a Facebook post advertising the garage sale. And however, like the flyer, it didn't say who Dot was or why the sale was being held. And as Dot said, she can't type. So she got a neighbour to upload the post for her. Immediately, you can see how the digital divide affects rural and elderly Australians. And this illustrates the importance of a local newspaper for the civic engagement of these groups. So I, like many people, would have seen the garage sale advertised on Facebook with the flyers, would not have known about Dot's situation without having been there and speaking to her. So support did come from those who lived close by her and from her immediate friends. Dot's immediate neighbours donated things for her to sell, and there was a movement by some people to offer help or find solutions, but largely it went unheard when usually a lot of people would have known about it and rallied behind it. So most people that participated in my study said that they knew Dot, and many said that they'd been helped by her or used her animal welfare shelter in the past. However, these same participants also said they had not heard about her situation, which demonstrates the disrupted flow of information. And it also shows that the communication channels that Dot used were inferior because they had a small and insignificant audience, particularly in a town with low levels of digital literacy. So being flyers and word of mouth, which is what Lightning Ridge residents use as their main sources of local news. So even well-connected people had not heard about Dot getting the list of fines. Sally Weeks, she grew up in Lightning Ridge and used to run the news agency and is a prominent member of the Australian Opal Centre. And she said, I didn't even know Dot was facing fines. The town would be lost without her dealing with injured pets. So residents linked the lack of information to their inability to respond, which shows a decline in impact and a damaged civic culture. So Kimbo Field, the woman who I quoted before, who I met at the pub, she said that in her view, when the Ridge News was printed, people would rally behind each other when someone was in trouble. Another quote, I didn't know anything about that, no idea. So if we had a paper, that's another thing a lot of people would have turned up to support. George Mulder, he's another resident who knows Dot well. And at the time of fieldwork, he stepped back from volunteering, but in the past, he actively participated in several Lightning Ridge volunteer organisations. And he also saw the important place that the Ridge News occupied in getting information out to the public, and how its closure meant Dot was left stranded with the problem and isolated from the community. George said, so something like that would have been in the paper and people would be able to read about it. And if they read about it, then they could have done something or come up with a solution. For example, I could have got a puppy off her before she had to get rid of him or donated something to a garage sale. So as of today, nothing's happened. The immediate threat of fines has kind of gone away and Dot hasn't been charged. So she's been left in a state of limbo, but she's continuing to operate her animal welfare shelter. But at the time, it was a real crisis for her and she felt really isolated, not having that local newspaper to be able to talk about what she was going through. So to conclude, because of Lightning Ridge's history of opal mining, because of its history of opal mining, Lightning Ridge has a unique civic culture that the Ridge News was very much a part of. Residents had a shared history and affinity with Lightning Ridge and a shared set of values that compelled them to act when needed. The local newspaper was the shared information source that people used to channel their civic activity. Without it, people went uninformed about issues such as Dot and a animal welfare shelter receiving funds. Yeah, that concludes my presentation.
Thanks, Marco. That was brilliant.
Thank you.
I did get blindsided a little bit by the volunteer morgue and the box of kittens.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Fantastic. I love the ethnographic nature of your work. It's just so unusual. So many people, I'm sure would love to be able to do that, but it's such a time commitment that you put into that. It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you. No, I felt really lucky that I was able to do it that way as well.
Yeah,
great experience.
I'll open it up to questions. So please feel free to just turn your mics on if you have a question and yell out. Or if you'd prefer, you can type it into the chat if you like, and I'll read it out for you. But open up the floor to anyone. Doesn't matter, I've got questions anyway, but hopefully others have questions too.
Oh, it's been a big day, so no worries.
It's been a big day, right?
Yeah.
I'll ask one.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Marco. I'm just wondering, because we lost our local newspaper during the early start of COVID last year, but we also have another newspaper based 50 kilometres down the road that sort of has stepped up and sort of covered that gap. Is there another newspaper nearby, like in Walgett or something like that, that has the potential to cover that gap, or is it just not happening?
There's a really famous community radio station in Burke that acquired their local newspaper, and they had plans to make it regional and give all the towns like a page of coverage. I'm not sure if that's happened. There's also a Walgett paper. However, the owners, I think, are looking to get out of it, and it doesn't seem like a very dynamic publication. In Lightning Ridge itself, there's a lot of talk about the need for a paper, and when I was there, like, a lot of people asked me to start one. But yeah, no one's been able to get one off the ground. Yeah,
interesting.
What about other forms? I mean, you mentioned the digital divide and Dot not being able to type, and probably there's even internet digital connectivity issues. I'm not sure in Lightning Ridge, but in some other places where local newspapers have died, other digital formats or even volunteer sort of run news sheets almost, or newsletters have popped up to sort of fill the gap. Has anything like that, not other papers like Sarah mentioned, trying to cover it, but something in another format, digital or print?
Yeah, there's one woman, she started a Facebook page that tries to replicate the functions of a local newspaper, but she's works full time. She's got 2 kids and does a whole lot of other volunteering, so she doesn't have that much time to dedicate to it. So she mainly posts press release and other things that come up through Google alerts. So yeah, she doesn't do any reporting, but she gathers information relevant to Lightning Ridge.
It's not quite the same, I suppose, is it? Like you mentioned, you can have a Facebook post, but it didn't communicate really what Dot was about and the reason behind it. But it looks like Bernadette has a question as well, but I think I missed Lucy's one. She says, and I don't want to miss over the Walgett newspaper bit. So Lucy, did you want to talk to the Walgett newspaper nearby?
Yeah, we print that publication in Gilgandra, and the owner of that, she's second generation. Her family, her father used to run it, and it has some coverage there of the further opal fields, but like you said, she doesn't quite have capacity to push into Lightning Ridge. She is literally a one-woman show herself, and yeah, she doesn't quite have capacity. And I think when she's tried, because they quite strong identity about Lightning Ridge, maybe it just doesn't quite translate that someone from Walgett is trying to come and push into that. and I see that in a lot of places too, those little towns, they want something that is them. If it's got the name of the next town in it, well, that's not what they want. So
Yeah,
yeah, she doesn't quite have capacity. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're sorry, did you say you own the company that prints the Walgett Spectator?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh,
Gilgandra
interesting.
News.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. How many papers are in your stable? Just out of curiosity.
Well, I've got 2 under me. We're opening a 3rd, and I print 3 others now.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah.
And
Nice.
I work with Lucy, and I'm absolutely in awe of what she's doing in that space.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's great to sorry, you go.
I was just going to say, I have since the Ridge News closed, I have every now and again had someone, random reach out to me and go, oh, I'm thinking about doing it for Lightning Ridge, but it never really goes anywhere. So I think you're right. I think there is a community appetite for it, but it just seems to me that the right sort of person that can really donate their time to it and make it really fly just hasn't quite come along to the Ridge yet.
Yeah. Yeah, you need a lot of skill, like, to make it work. I think one guy like tried to start one, and it was like an A4 newsletter printed out of his shed, but it didn't last very long. Yeah.
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 Yeah. I've had a couple
How would
of
you go
people
about? How would you go about getting someone, like, the proper person to run it?
Well, it's more, I mean, like, for an extension of what we've done, and if you chime into my session tomorrow, I'll probably go into it a bit more, but we sort of expanded similar place like an ACM closure at Nyngan. We pretty much just put a journalist over there working from home, and then everything else is done from Gil. So you get that local content, but all the hard part of running and producing a newspaper is already done, because we have that economy of scale already in Gilgandra.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably key, isn't it? You've got someone on the ground to give that local feel and the local presence, but the stress of it is elsewhere. I handled by a bigger thing. Bernadette, I wanted to get to you because we're running out of time a little bit. I know you've been waiting on there.
Oh, that's fine. I feel like I should just leave it to Lucy and Michael and Marco and you to chat. And yeah, also in awe of Lucy, because I think the business side of it is not necessarily what draws you into being a journalist, and then just, single-handedly trying to cover a place. But Marco, I was just kind of interested, particularly granted the significant transient population at Lightning Ridge, which is obviously a bit of an issue, but of the the resident population, what the demographics are. I'm assuming it skews older, and wondering, I guess, what else you think is missing out in terms of that shared experience, and whether or not there's alternatives. About 17 questions in one, just to make the most of the last 2 minutes. You can just pick out whichever bit you feel like talking about or not. But what there is also then for for other demographics, whether they've just gone off into little splinter groups and got their own little Facebook community groups, and whether there's any other sort of forums that bring the whole town together. Because I guess I'm just thinking about the whole algorithmic delivery of news. You're not looking at the same things. They're thinking about what Alison said earlier about the Bullock Times, how when they post a digital edition that is the whole paper, everyone's still sort of consuming the whole same story, what they pick out of that or not, rather than just being served up selective bites. And if they've got separate Facebook pages, they're also being divided. So yeah, I guess it's kind of a demographic question in terms of what else there is.
So the demographics, I think like 50%. Only 50% of houses are connected to the internet. That was in the 2016 census. I think it's significantly older population than national average. And yeah, I don't know what would bind everyone together. I think the bowling club, people say that, like, you go to the bowling club and that's draws in the broadest range of people. Yeah, and so conversations happen there, and that was a large one of the major ways local news has got disseminated.
They got cheap pints at the bowling club.
Yeah, I was going to say pint and Palmer special on a Thursday night.
Yeah, they got all that, and like 30% off for members. So.
And Lucy multi-skilling as well, because she's not wearing enough hats yet.
Yeah.
All right, that's great. Look, I think this discussion could go on for ages. It's such a good group of people and such a good presentation on a really interesting town and the loss of a newspaper and the civic cultural impact that it's had. So thank you, Marco, for your great presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for all watching it. I really appreciate that this late in the day.
Yeah, great participation at 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that I think that is the end of the day's proceedings, but you can go back to the group website if you like. Otherwise, there's tomorrow's session, including Lucy's one, which I'm sure we'll all be in and hanging out for. So yes, thank you, Marco, and thanks everyone for your participation.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Bye.
Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Marco. Bye.